Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. and today I'm reviewing Letters from Whitechapel. Letters from Whitechapel is a 1 to 6 player game. A 1 to 6 player game in which you are playing as, well, one player is playing as Jack the Ripper, who's slowly hunting through the night, trying to eventually, well, let's not get into what you're actually doing. You're playing as Jack the Ripper, and you're trying to do things across 4 rounds of play. The other 5 players, or up to 5 players, I should say, you could have a single player playing again as all the characters, or you could have 5 different players, any variation or combination thereof, playing as the 5 policemen. The policemen who are wandering across town, slowly trying to track down Jack the Ripper, moving from intersection to intersection around the board, trying to close the gap and trace out where he is before he does the next, well, let's not talk about it. But Jack the Ripper, Letters from Whitechapel, that's basically what's going on in this game. You have 4 rounds of play, and the general idea is every single round, you're going to go through a full sequence of like 8 steps. I'm not going to heavily get into them because a lot of them are, well, fairly pedantic. So I'm going to cover the whole level of what's going on, and the pedantic stuff does need to be followed, but we'll get into it. Basically, every single round, Jack the Ripper is going to, before the game begins, Jack the Ripper is going to pick a single area on the little board over here. They're going to mark down on their board sheet down here what their hideout location is on the board. They're going to pick a single location on this board, any number, that is going to be their hideout. That is the place that Jack needs to return to every single night. From there, you're going to go ahead and go through a sequence in which players are going to place down the various possible locations where the Wretched are, well, you know, let's not talk about the spaces on the board. There are spaces on the board where different pieces will be put down, and then the players playing as the police officers will collaborate, talk, and figure out where they're putting down their tokens. These tokens are going to come with a few different types in terms of these tokens over here. They're going to look black on both sides over here. When you flip them over, there we go, that's one of the policemen. Similarly, for the Wretched over here, we have some tokens that are going to be, you know, white on one side, and some tokens that are red on the others. You're going through a process of placing them down, trying to bluff or double bluff, or make sure you think the other player is or isn't where they're supposed to be. Then you'll slowly reveal everything, at which point the crime will occur, bad things will happen. We won't talk about exactly what they are, but bad things will happen, at which point the police officers now know the location of the crime. They'll go ahead and mark the location of the crime, perhaps it's this location over here, and now the various police officers have to close the distance on Jack. The problem is, Jack at this point is trying to figure out how to get back to his hideout, while being mindful of the fact that the police officers know where he was. Not where he is, where he was. And every single turn is going to be a back and forth as Jack, on this little behind the screen over here, starts marking what he did, where he's going, and all that stuff. Well, not what he did, we won't talk about that, but where he's going. So for example, let's say this is the scene of the crime over here, Jack will immediately mark down a number behind his screen. So if this is the scene, maybe over here he marks down 66, maybe 99, maybe 86. You see, Jack travels along these white dots, so once we know the scene of the crime, we know one of his next possible spots, but we don't know which one it is. In fact, there's so many possible spots that he could have gone to from over here. All these spots are viable options. And so the police officers start the process of closing the distance. Every single time you can go ahead and you can move up to 2 nodes. They move along black nodes over here. And as you do so, you're going to be asking questions about potentially, is this a spot where Jack is in an attempt to capture him? Or alternatively, is this a spot where Jack was in order to find out whether he ever made his way there? Are you looking for evidence or are you trying to capture Jack? You're going to be moving all the police officers around the board, slowly closing the distance. And eventually you'll start to figure out where he was. You'll go ahead and you'll move a spot and you'll say, were you ever on 67? Jack says no, at which point you know that's one location that was off, but it could still be 51, it could be 66. Starting to trace that initial aspect of which direction he headed will start to close the distance as far as where he is on this board. The whole idea is you're trying to capture him before he gets back to his hideout, although you do have 4 nights, and that's part of the charm of this game. Using the word charm in this game is probably the wrong terminology. That's part of the strategic appeal of this game. You see, across 4 nights, you're going to be following a pathway where you likely won't catch Jack that first night. You likely won't. Just the way he has an advantage, and we haven't even gotten some of the tokens he has. He has these carriages and, you know, secret alleyways he can utilize every single round, or different number of them every single round. But utilizing those gives him the opportunity to move extra distance or to walk through buildings. If he's at 67 and he marks that he used a secret alleyway that turn, he could now be on anywhere around this block or anywhere around this block. He can move through blocks effectively, completely befuddling the police officers as far as where he is and what he did, which gives Jack a big advantage over the police officers. Until you factor in the fact that as you go through these nights, you're slowly tracing where Jack was. Maybe this is the scene of the crime, and maybe through the slow process of moving around the board, of tracing, of slowly closing the distance, maybe you start to notice a pattern. He was on 66, then he was on 50, then he was on 31. You notice that he's on these certain areas, and you see him wandering around this section of the board, and now you have to ask yourself, Was he wandering around that section of the border because that's how he had to get from the scene of the crime to his hideout? Or is that part of the process where he just tries to evade you and trick you into where he is? Because Jack knows, as a player, Jack knows that he has to last 4 rounds. That's 4 rounds of different crimes happening, all with slow trails of progression towards a hideout and a limited number of time. You have a fixed number of rounds before Jack has to get back to his hideout that night. And so the game is a process of learning information round to round, of picking up pieces of the trail every single round, of understanding where he moved on the board, that over here he was moving around this and over here, but you also caught a glimpse of him over here. So now if he's over here and he's over here, where was he trying to go to? The next night you have another crime, and this time it's over here, and this time you see Jack heading this way, but maybe there's a little bit of trace of him over here. Was he heading here, then here? What was he doing, and how was he trying to trick the police officers into where he was? And that's basically what's going on as far as Jack the Ripper. It's 4 rounds of play. Jack picks a hideout. You're going to have the scenes of the crime. You're going to have the police officers trying to track him down. In between every round, there's a little bit of a cleanup phase as far as where the police officers restart, where you put two new ones out. There's going to be those carriages that let you move to and let you move through police officers, which can be very helpful, because otherwise you can't do that. There's going to be the secret alleyways that let you jump through different areas, and you'll get a limited number of tokens every single round. In round 3, out of the 4 rounds, Jack's going to do 2 things that we won't talk about. So we're going to have round 1, 2, 3, and 4. And round 3 is going to be harder for the police officers, although Jack does have less secret tokens he can use at that point, so it's a bit of a toss-up as far as how that plays out. And there's a bunch of balancing factors in the game. Small rules, we're going to have the letters that Jack can use, we're going to have different small rules adjustments, different things to balance different sides of the game. If you find that the police officers or Jack is winning or losing too much, there are ways to adjust or mitigate around that. And that is basically Jack the Ripper. That's basically Letters from Whitechapel. Which brings us to the review, starting off with ease of play. The game rules are, for the most part, pretty easy to get into. This game, the core cycle is very simple to follow. There's a bit of tediousness in the actual steps of execution every single round. There's a whole step of placing, and then moving, and then revealing, and then moving a bit more. There's a whole step which Jack could even try to buy time. We didn't talk about this, but there's ways for Jack to try to buy time, but that also gives the police officers opportunities to move the Wretched around the board in a way that helps them in the game. And so lots of small little tedious aspects that I think is like 8 or 9 steps every single round you have to go through, when the core gameplay cycle comes down to the police officers to each take an action, to move and take an action, and then Jack moves around the board trying to get back to his hideout. The core cycle is pretty simple, but lots of steps to follow through it. Past that, game time can range drastically depending on when Jack is caught. It can be as short as half an hour for a game, or as much as 2 hours on the long end. I'd say typically in the 60 to 90 minute range. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking, first of all, I particularly appreciate the iterative process of the game. The fact that you're going through that cycle in the game in which you have to go through multiple rounds of play, and in each round of play, you're trying to figure out what's going on in the game. Where's Jack going? Where's he trying to, trick you into figuring out? Because a player who plays as Jack that's only mindful of that one round will lose the game. You have to know that there's multiple rounds in play. You have to understand that you have to take your time, jump around different locations. Make sure you're always one step ahead of the police officers so you're not caught, while also giving yourself enough time to actually slowly plant places of evidence around the board. That they see you in this neighborhood and that neighborhood, and now next round, they have less of an idea of exactly where you're going to. It takes strategy, time, and patience to play as Jack properly in the game, and the fact that the game is effectively staggered over multiple rounds gives the police time to, it gives Jack the opportunity to feel clever for constantly evading the police, while giving the police the opportunities and the windows to slowly put together pieces of information across multiple nights until eventually they can get a bit of more of an informational guide as to where Jack is going to next and how to stop him from getting there in time. I also like the balancing options around the game. This is a game where it's very easy. I think the general consensus is that if you go with the core rules and no adjustments, I think the general consensus is that Jack has an advantage. But if you add different things to balance out the players, you'll find that the police officers can very much catch up. And then depending on the player group, depending on, the interactions, depending on the player count even, there's different things you can do to make the game balanced so that you're playing on a tightly woven playfield, which both players or both teams are both trying to vie and stay one step ahead of each other. The game also typically plays pretty quickly for the experience that it delivers. Those 2-hour games that I mentioned, those are probably the rarity for the most part. I think typically you can get in a game in 60 minutes with if you're playing at lower player counts. One thing I didn't really heavily talk about is, and we'll talk about this shortly, and the things I don't like, this is a game that's very much suited to be a 2-player experience. Yes, you could play it at higher player counts, but it functions best at 2, and when you're playing it at 2, it can be a quick experience, often 60 minutes or less for a lot of rounds of slowly trying to trace them out. And again, I like that fact that both players have the opportunity to feel clever at different points. Jack will spend rounds evading the police officers, but the police officers will often eventually get their path on a trail, and whether or not they catch him in the end, by the time they get to that 3rd or 4th round, they often have a decent enough idea of what's going on that it feels like a real cat and mouse chase. As far as what I don't like, First of all, I mentioned already, this is really a two-player game. There are a lot of hidden movement games out there, and they function differently at different player counts, but the very nature of the fact that you have 5 police officers in this game just has a weird balance. I feel like 4 would have been better. Obviously, you'd have to rebalance the game, because 4 allows for a few different player counts. You could have a 4 versus 1. You could have a 2 versus 1 with 2 players controlling 2 people each. You could have a 1 versus 1 with 1 person controlling 4 each. Controlling 5 versus 1 just leaves a very interesting number in which, at that point, you either have one player controlling all 5 police officers, or you have to share control with the other players. It doesn't divide into any 2, 3, or 4 at all, so it's kind of all or nothing. It's either 5 or 1, which means 5 police officers leads to either a 1 versus 1 game, where one player controls all 5 police officers against Jack, or alternatively, it leads to a distributed game which one player is controlling more than another. And while some people might be fine with that, I personally never like games in which we're controlling an uneven amount of characters. Is it doable? Yes. Do I love it? Not as much. Past that, the general table talk and all that stuff, there's not enough decision space in each character for the game to be interesting if you're controlling a single character. So I think this works. I think it still works as a 2 versus 1, because you just have to figure out how you're controlling and distributing the characters, but I think it works best as a 1 versus 1, and 2 versus 1 is tolerable, and once you go past that, I think there's not enough decision space to keep things interesting. There's a lot of decision space across 5 characters, there's not a lot across a singular character in the game. As far as... that's the first thing I don't like. There's other things. Second of all, is it can be a little vanilla as an investigator in the game. This is a game of slowly moving around the board, trying to piece out what's going on, trying to just move, take an action, move, take an action, move, take an action in the game state, while Jack slowly evades you. It's always fun to be that hidden player, to have something a little behind the scenes, but playing as the investigators, it's a little... the overall game of Jack the Ripper, it gives you things that adjust for difficulty and balance, but the pure game state is fairly vanilla as far as hidden movement games go. We'll talk more about this in recommendations, but I think that this game is excellent at what it does while being very dry and samey game to game. As far as I can see others not liking, first of all, the obvious theme is a factor here. I keep dodging and dancing around what's going on in this game for the sake of half comedy, but half because it's dark and gruesome. The idea that you are a player who's actually trying to recreate the Nights of Jack the Ripper, that could be a factor in your enjoyment of this game. This is not like an abstract war game where you're controlling hordes of troops on the battlefield and things are like more ambient. This is like recreating horrific events of a specific person in history. It might bother you, and I understand if it does. Secondly, is there are a lot of steps that feel like they matter, but also feel tedious at the same time. This goes back to the accessibility, the rules I mentioned already, where the core gameplay loop is fairly precise, but the actual steps you're taking every single day feel a little bit tedious. I think they matter more the higher your strategy level is, but a lot of them just feel like, do this, then this, then this, when I feel it could have been condensed to 3 or 4 steps that would have had most of the strategic benefit of the game, while not being as, here are 8 steps, and really you're going to spend 90% of your playtime in one of those steps. As far as final thoughts on Letters from Whitechapel, I really like this one. It's a good game. It's just a good, simple game. I've been diving more into hidden movement games. I played a lot of hidden movement games in my time in gaming, whatnot. Spectre Ops, Beast. I've not played Fear of Dracula. I played Mind Management. There's a bunch of hidden movement games out there that are all really enjoyable in what they do, and Letters from Whitechapel is one of the earlier ones. This is like post Scotland Yard, which might be like one of the original ones. Scotland Yard is great. This feels like this feels like a very strong, stable addition to the genre, or I should say one of the originators of the genre. This is a good game that gives you a lot of choice as far as how you're going to work with all the police officers on the table to slowly encircle and capture Jack across multiple rounds of play. It is quick, it is clean, it is precise at what it's doing. It is a little lacking in variability, and there is, of course, the theme aspect to take into account, and the player count factor, so there are things to be mindful of as to whether this is a game for you or not. For me, as a 2-player head-to-head experience, this is an excellent hidden movement game that, for me, is a 4 out of 5. I just like what it's doing. There's some fiddly aspects as far as the rules itself, but it's just, as far as the steps you have to take in the rules itself are actually pretty clear, but the steps you have to take are a little bit tedious. But overall, it's quick, it's clean, it plays well. It's just a very good game in the hidden movement genre. As far as other game recommendations, first of all, I mentioned Beast already. Beast and Mind Management are the 2 I'm going to go with here. I think Beast is a fantastic game. Not yet available. It was on Kickstarter. It'll be available soon enough. And then Mind Management from Off the Page Games. One of my favorite hidden movement games in general. Just a fantastic experience. Both of those leaning a lot more into different avenues. Mind Management being very clear and to the point with a degree of iteration as far as the ways to adjust the player side, similar to the way in Letters from Whitechapel. And then Beast will have a lot more in terms of player powers and ways to mix up the experience. But both are other fantastic hidden movement games that I highly recommend. In any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.